Professor Rosen, where you talk about, well, they're going to get criticized anyway. So we saw 2015, this quote just haunts me, where the former president of CBS, Les Moonves, openly said, well, Donald Trump isn't good for America, but he's good for CBS. And Jeff Zucker kind of said the same thing for CNN. Well, you get Trump. Trump's president. Unleashes violence by targeting journalists, right? Like literally Cesar Sayoc, people forget this, had a hit list based on Trump's critics and sent out bombs. And thank God he was convicted. People could have died. So these journalists and reporters now, these political journalists that you've talked about, literally are threatened. They're intimidated. There's violence against them. They're hated. They're called enemy of the state. Fast forward to 2022. You got the CBS co-president, according to internal memos, saying, we think Republicans are going to win the midterms, so we need to court them. You got CNN now, the new president, Chris Licht, and the shareholder, John Malone, saying, we need to court more Republicans and go down the middle. And so I'm sitting here, can you explain this phenomenon where this class of journalists who have literally survived intimidation, threats, violence in 2022 are saying, we're going to enable and empower the people who hate us and play both sides? Like, how do you explain this to our listeners that the people who are being actually targeted by MAGA are sucking up to MAGA?
Well, part of it is there's two types of voices that you're quoting there. There's the bosses who run the newsrooms and who run the media companies that own the newsrooms. And they're free to say things like, may not be good for America, but it's good for CBS. And they're kind of acting from on high upon the journalists at CNN and CBS. I think it's generally admitted, even by somebody like Jeff Zucker, that they went overboard in the initial year or two of Trump coverage. And they kind of realized that was a mistake. But the journalists who are closer to the ground and actually have to report on this story, I think they know that things are pretty bad, especially with Trump. And I'd like to give you an example of this. A year ago, Jonathan Karl, who is ABC White House correspondent, also very important, a past president of the White House Correspondents Association, so somebody that I would call a consensus figure in the press, was looking ahead to 2024 and the likelihood that Trump was going to win. And he said some really blunt things about how challenging it was going to be to report on this guy. So he said things like, you're covering essentially an anti-democratic candidate. This is Jonathan Karl talking. You're covering somebody who's running in a system that is trying to undermine that same system. I totally agree. But again, this is John Karl. He says, you're going to know from the start that he's perpetually lying. Again, this is ABC's White House correspondent with what we already know before the 2024 campaign has even started. He's used the stop the steal lie so many times. Karl said, so that people are going to believe it, and we can't be a conduit for that, he said. He asked, what does a debate look like with Donald Trump in it? How do you even do an interview with this guy? So what he's saying is all of the normal tools that we have for reporting a presidential election are broken. He's admitting that.
And the fact, I just want for the listeners to know, the fact that John Karl is saying this, like a traditional establishment, centrist, down the middle, respected by Republicans, white dude. It's not me and Danielle, the crazy folks.
Right. And when Brian Stelter, who's conducting the interview, gets around to saying, okay, so how do we fix this? He really says, I don't know. I don't really know, but I'm just telling you, we're going to have major problems with our traditional practices if he runs again, which most people assume that he will and probably will announce that rather soon. So, see, that's a little bit of a different picture because at least Jonathan Karl, who is a consensus figure in the American press, is saying we're kind of out of answers here, right? And it goes back to what I said about that mental picture that lies beneath the practices of the press. it's broken. It's not of use. And one of the problems that journalists have is that they need a new consensus to replace the one that they used to use every 4 years, right? Because, as John Carl noted, they face new threats. And this is the work that I think is kind of missing from elite journalism, even as they appoint their democracy desks and find their democracy teams and pay more attention to threats to democracy, which is good, and start examining the election system, which is also good. They still haven't kind of confronted that their equipment is broken.
And the funny part about that, which is not funny, haha, but just funny, sad, is that Donald Trump was the prototype. Now you're talking to a myriad of different candidates and politicians who are following the same exact playbook that Donald Trump laid out. So while you have, Carl talking about, well, he's going to lie and he's going to do these things, and how do we do these interviews? It's like, well, that's the entirety of the Republican Party and everybody that you sit down with, whether they're running for school board or they're running for president of the United States, they all have become a carbon copy. And so the problem here is that there is for what I see as a problem is that there is a nimbleness and agility that is required in today's journalism that isn't present because it has never had to be. Right. It has been a place of reporting, of observation, and of description and analysis. But now it's like in real time, we're not just fact checking, we're having to deliver to the American people that you are living in abnormal times. Yeah. And so, Professor Rosen, in that sense, you are educating, right, tomorrow's, newsrooms. And I'm wondering, what are the tools that are being discussed about how this new wave of journalists are going to have the agility, kind of like athletes, to be able to keep pace with these increasingly abnormal times?
Yes. I think that image of agility is a really good one, Danielle. And it is something that journalists are going to have to learn. Here's some things that I would like to see. My suggestions are more at the level of what I call press think, which is how the press models and understands these problems. And I try to have an impact on that. So some of the things that I would like to see this more agile press do is, first, they have to learn how to make clear what is at stake. This is something that I repeatedly try to get them to do. Be clear, be blunt about what is at stake if this kind of candidate wins, if the election system can be manipulated, if there's no security to handling the ballots, right? They have to move several steps ahead and say, this is what could happen. This is what is at stake. They also have to make it clear that American democracy runs not only on the formal rules laid out in the Constitution, but the informal agreements that have always guided our politics, sometimes called the guardrails of democracy. Those things were really important because they prevented candidates from playing what law professors call constitutional hardball, which means if you do everything to the max that's allowed in the Constitution, you eventually break democracy, because so much of it works when we agree on these informal rules, like don't cheat the vote, right? Election counting and election administration that was bipartisan. That system existed for many decades. It's not that nobody ever tried to fool around with it or that it was totally perfect, but it was a bipartisan agreement that we run elections in a certain way, and that's all gone now. And so we have to make it clear that American democracy always ran on these rules that are now almost completely ignored in some sense, in some cases. And we also have to ask journalists to make it clear to themselves and to their public that when you have asymmetry between the major parties, Republicans are trying to break the system. The Democrats are trying to win within it. And you portray that symmetrically, that is distortion. So a symmetric portrait of a asymmetric reality is inherently a distortion, right? And my hope is that if some of these ideas, which are not super complicated or abstract to me, can get through, then the corresponding practices can be created in an agile, as you say, way as they are needed. But it all goes back to the collapse of the foundations on which horse race, both sides, conventional journalism was created decades ago. And one of the problems we have is that a lot of the political reporters grew up in that system.
Yep.
And they want it to go on.
That's right.
Because they want their chance at boys on the bus glory, if you see what I mean. They want the opportunity to do what they've always admired older journalists at doing. And one of the unknowns of this campaign is whether a new reality in American journalism, which is the arrival in newsrooms of a new generation that is inherently more diverse, that agrees that America has to be a multiracial society. Those people have been, after a long struggle, hired into these mainstream newsrooms. And they don't necessarily think the same way about issues like objectivity as their editors. That's a new condition.
Yeah.
There's always been a new generation hired into newsrooms, but they thought just like the older generation.
Right.
Now we have some conflict there. And one of the things we don't know is where is that conflict going to lead? But it's a very significant development, because if you hire somebody under the logic that you need a newsroom that looks more like America, and you need more people from groups that have not supplied most of the journalists before, and then you ask those same journalists to forget where they came from and just obey the rules of the profession, that is like a contradiction. So what happens within the frame of that contradiction is one of the unknowns about this election, and it definitely is going to be a bigger issue in 2024.